Well, it's nice to see everyone. Welcome. I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. And I'll just first frame it by saying, right now we're in a period of time in the field of the arts. It's not just music, but in all of the arts where many of our institutions are really trying to have some thoughtful conversations about diversifying themselves and trying to be more inclusive. And this is a moment in time which is important to just have a little bit more of an agency around the end goal for us all and for all of our institutions. And again, the way we do that is just by having some conversations about it and making sure that there might be this collective moment for us all to get closer and closer to being on the same page. So here are my objectives for us for today. I thought it was a good idea for me to just be really, really clear about what some of the objectives were. The first one is to identify supportive ways for individuals and organizations to engage in authentic dialogue about creating inclusive programming. I wanted to make sure to put the qualifier authentic dialogue because many places are engaging in dialogue. And so we want to have a conversation today about what are some ways in which we can think about having a more authentic dialogue about creating inclusive programming? The second one is centering our conversation around our shared desire to create a more equitably inclusive arts ecosystem. Now, I'm operating under an assumption there that we all have a shared desire, but that being the objective, it is operating under that assumption that we do want to create a more equitably inclusive arts ecosystem. If you're here and you don't want to do that, you might be at the wrong session, but just being really candid about that is what this session is doing, and that is an assumption that's being made. The third one is using our collective talents to engage in a constructive dialogue about the future of our fields. And it was nice to hear from several folks. There are people who are from music, but also from theater as well. And so I want to be really thoughtful about making it not completely centered around music, although because my background is having been a musician for a long time, that's going to be my area of expertise. But I also wanted to keep it broad enough that if you are here representing a theater company, visual arts, or any other type of performance genre, that you can feel that you can follow along in the conversation, even when we might, from time to time, deviate into conversations about music. And then also as it relates to our collective talents, again, I do want this to be a conversation. So in those moments in which I've created some guiding questions for you, and I will ask folks to feel comfortable sharing that when we get to the guiding questions part and the conversation question answer component, I will give some guidelines for us, but I do want us to engage in that time together. And then the final one is to move closer to accepting the fact that there are no solutions that are perfectly right, while developing the humility to understand when we might have done wrong. And I think that understanding those two components, I think is going to be an important objective for us today. That there are no perfectly right answers, but there are probably some wrong ones, but also having some humility to recognize when there might be some potentially wrong framing. And by wrong framing, what I mean is it might be damaging, traumatic, and violent and aggressive to an individual or a group, and I would consider that to be wrong. Okay. So here is our agenda. Now that you have our objectives, here is our agenda for today. I have welcomed you. Welcome. We have gone through the objectives. Equity and inclusion at CMCB. I'm going to tell you a little bit about CMCB and some of the language that we have created to help guide us in our values around equity and inclusion. I'll make a land acknowledgement. I'll tell you a little bit about myself because that's the thing that really frames some of my perspectives on the language. We're going to talk about the idea of unlearning. Many people think that you can enter a conversation just with the idea of learning, but it's actually the opposite. Typically, you have to enter a conversation preparing to unlearn, unlearning the things that you might have been taught systemically so that you then have the space to learn something different. And something that might be very different than what you originally taught. And oftentimes those things can be in quite a bit of conflict with each other that you have to go through a process of unlearning. So it's really untangling the knot is also a component of the process. And then we're going to codify some terms. I think a lot about language, and I have continued to think a lot about language as I have aged and been given opportunities to use language. So we're going to codify some terms. Many of them are terms you're familiar with, but what we'll do is we'll create a shared definition for us for these terms so that as those terms are being used throughout our time together tonight, we all have a shared definition. We're going to use my definitions for now. If you have a separate one, we can talk about that in the question and answer, but we'll start with the definitions that I'm sharing, and those are the ones that will guide us through. And then as we start having this conversation and thinking about tokenism versus celebration, I put this, there's a section here called important questions to ask with no blame, no shame, and no guilt. I think that to that point about being humble and having a certain type of humility when engaging in this process, that's really required. And so there are some really important and really courageous questions that each of us will probably have to ask ourselves in our institutions and ask ourselves when building programs, but being able to do them from a perspective of no blame, no shame, and no guilt is really important. And so that is one of the frames that we'll use as well, is again, just operating under the assumption that there's no blame, no shame, no guilt. We'll ask questions about the organizations and the systems where they exist, as well as some questions for when you're trying to create an individual program, because the idea is to support organizations and individuals and groups in the conversation about creating program and potentially open up that conversation to new ways of thinking that maybe weren't part of it in the past. Okay, so CMCB's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee has come up with some language that I want to make sure that I share with you today. The CMCB welcomes individuals and values all voices. These voices will continue to include those from different races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, genders, abilities, faiths, nationalities, ages, and socioeconomic statuses. Program offerings, and we're thinking about what that means inside CMCB. We're going to have program offerings that reflect the interests of our various communities, curricula that support the neurodiversity of our community, resources invested equitably among different partnerships, reflecting the diversity of our communities, expanded access to music learning and enrichment within and across greater Boston neighborhoods, assembling, creating, and recruiting from a diverse slate of candidates for staff, faculty, corporation, and board member positions, ongoing community conversations to inform our priorities. You are participating in one of those conversations right now. Provide for the related evolving educational needs of our communities, create spaces that welcome, include, and ensure safety for all, implement feedback mechanisms which drive continuous improvement, and employment and teaching practices that minimize the impact of implicit bias. We recognize that implicit bias exists and it's a thing and it manifests itself in many ways. So the first step for us on our journey is to try to minimize the impact of that bias. Hopefully removing it completely, but beginning by removing the impact of it. Want to make sure that we make a land acknowledgement as well. At CMCB, we recognize that we are on the unceded territory of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag people, and we pay respects to their elders, past and present. We acknowledge the truth of violence perpetuated in the name of this country. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. We make this acknowledgement as a step towards dismantling the legacy of settler colonialism and with a commitment to social justice. Now, I'm actually gonna go back to that one. I can do it, I'll talk about me first. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself before I ask you all to put your names and organizations into the chat, hint, hint, so that we know who all is here. As you are comfortable, please feel free to write your name and your organization in the chat so that folks can know who's here. These are also important opportunities for networking. And so I wanna make sure that people have an opportunity to learn what organizations are interested in engaging in this conversation, not only locally, but nationally as well. If you're a CMCB board member, you can say that so people can see how cool our board members are. But I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So my name is Lecolion, Washington. I grew up in Dallas. I am a person who came from a disinvested Black and predominantly Mexican neighborhood. When I was in 6th grade, they gave me this bassoon and they said, you are going to play that. And I said, well, what is it? And they said, it's a bassoon. And I was like, okay, I don't know what that is, but my sister is in the band. I guess I got to be in the band. Thanks for giving me this bassoon. And that is really my start on the bassoon. I had no romantic moment where I went to a symphony orchestra concert and I heard someone playing Peter of the Wolf. And I was like, oh my goodness, I really want to do that. That was not my own personal journey. It was really just, they handed it to me and I was assumed that you played whatever they gave you. That led to my a couple of decades performance career. And I put some things here. The reason I put these things here is because oftentimes when you're talking about navigating and altering and evolving systems, there's an assumption that you weren't able to succeed inside the system. That's why you want to change it. And the truth is I had plenty of success as a performing musician for a couple of decades. And I still recognize that there are some opportunities inside that system that I was raised in for quite a bit of a manner of evolution. So I put a few things here. These are all multiple countries and continents, but the one in the middle is the most significant photo in this entire slide. For about 10 years, I was on the faculty of the Stellenbosch International Chamber Music Festival. For those of you who are wine drinkers, you know Stellenbosch is a wine region in South Africa. And it's got great wine. I recommend picking some up. They all tend to be pretty good. Pinotages are the best. One of the years that I was teaching at this festival, now this festival, they were bringing musicians from all over the world, a lot of musicians from Europe. I was really one of the first musicians coming from the States, and I was definitely one of the first Black musicians to go to this big international classical chamber music festival. Now, this is in the early 2000s, which is, maybe 10 years after the end of apartheid in South Africa. After going there for many years, my last year there, the concert, the second to last night, I think we were there, the narrator for that concert was Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And so that photo is a photo of me with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, if you don't recognize his face. So he's the narrator at this performance. He shows up afterwards. There's the line to shake Archbishop Desmond Tutu's hand. I walk through. I'm maybe the second or third because when you're the performers, you're the artists, you get to be first and everyone else has to be last. Nice, there's an interesting caste system there for musicians. And so I was maybe second or third in line. I go to shake Archbishop Desmond Tutu's hand and he grips my hand as I'm preparing to just walk past, assuming that I got the photo op with Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he leans up and he puts his hand on my arm and comes up on my shoulder and pulls me down to chat with him. And so I'm looking, there's hundreds of people behind. And so I'm looking at his handlers. I'm like, is this a thing? Or like, what do I do now? They were just like, nope, he does this sometimes, have a seat. So I kneel down, I start having this conversation with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and he says, I've heard about you. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, I've heard about you. And you have no idea what it means to our country for our young people to grow up seeing you on that stage. You have no idea what your presence in our country is doing. And I was just like, and then he starts at this point telling me a story as to why that's so significant. And I remember walking away from that conversation and we sat there for quite a while with a very annoyed set of a few hundred people behind us, just chatting. And I remember at that moment thinking, it's not just what I'm doing on the stage that matters. It's everything about me. I take my whole self onto that stage. Every component of my identity is on that stage alongside me, not just what's coming out the end of my bell. And so that really changed my entire perspective on what I was doing in music, not only as a teacher, but also as a performer as well. At that time, I'd already recorded a CD of music for bassoon by Black composers, but I just thought it was a really cool project, right? Like I was like, that's a great project. And I really want to be the Black bassoonist that records that CD. But after meeting Archbishop Desmond Tutu, because those CDs were, of course, on sale at the at this performance in South Africa. And so I really started to learn that there's more to what we're doing, and it requires more thought, I think, than we typically give it. And so that really forced me down a whole path of really thinking through, to what end am I doing this work? And it's not just to promote 17th and 18th and 19th century Western European art music. And so that was a whole new journey for me. And that led me here to the Community Music Center in Boston. For those of you who are not familiar with CMCB, we are one of the largest community music schools in the country. We're in the South End in Boston. We also are the largest provider of arts education in the Boston Public Schools. And we also engage in music therapy partnerships as well. So we also work with Health and Human Services institutions all over the city. So this is a place where, as I myself start thinking about my own impact on the field, CMCB is like really an amazing sandbox to just play in. It's an amazing place to really just see all of these various possible ways that music can impact an individual. So it's been a really cool place for me to get to know the institution, get to know its people, and by its people, I also mean its constituencies and its constituents in the city. So here's our mission and vision. And don't worry, this will be the last CMCB slide, but I have to plug our amazing institution. Our mission is to transform lives by providing equitable access to excellent music education and arts experiences. And our recently edited vision is as such. CMCB supports children, young people, and adults to engage in equitable, culturally inclusive, and learner-centered music education programs. These programs are intended to foster the following outcomes for participants and the communities with which we partner. And we make sure that we use the word partner and not serve. Serve assumes a certain amount of passivity on your partner. So we don't serve anyone, we partner with a lot of people. Deepen engagement with music through knowledge, skills, and artistry. Increase access to equitable, culturally inclusive, and learner-centered music education. Contribute to social, emotional development and social connections. Increase wellness and well-being. Develop skill sets for those learners interested in pursuing performance and non-performance-based music careers. And so that is really what we're doing as an organization moving forward. Now, on to unlearning. I like these, the Yoda one, you must unlearn what you have learned. That's my favorite. But I also like this, this quote that's attributed to Albert Einstein. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And I think that that's such an important way of navigating the concept of unlearning. Because we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. Okay. So has anyone outside of CMCB ever heard of the Johari Window? Most people in CMCB have heard of the Johari Window because I use it all the time. So if you've been to a presentation with me, you have seen that. It's a really helpful tool when navigating the idea of perspective and just like, what does it mean to have a certain perspective? At the top, you have things that are known to self, things not known to self. On the left, you have, and vertically, you have things known to others and not known to others. So for example, I told you all that I played the bassoon. Some of you might have known that before, but maybe all of you didn't. Now that bit of information is in the arena. That's the space where we play. Things you know, things that I know. And then I have some things that are known to me that you don't know about me. Those are things that might be my facade, right? Things I know that you don't know. One of the things you may not know, and I'm feeling it now, is that doing these types of presentations, they always make me super nervous still to this day. And I do them all the time. But I have learned to mimic the behaviors and language and patterns of someone who is confident. And so it might appear as such, but you don't know what my heart is doing, right? And so that's my facade. And then you have the things that are not known to self, things I don't know about me that you might know about me. Those are my blind spots. I have a former student of mine here who I will not name because I've not been given his permission, but there's probably things about me that my former student knows that are blind spots of mine, things that he knows about me that I don't know about myself. Those are my blind spots. If I ask him for feedback about those things and he shares them with me, he's giving me a gift because he's taken something from my blind spot and put into the arena for me. So he's given me a gift. And then there are these things that are not known to self and not known to others. Things I don't know about me, things you don't know about me, things that are just kind of unknown. That's actually the area that many organizations are trying to play in right now. This area where I don't actually know what is here. There might be some who know, but there are many people who don't know what that future looks like. And so thinking about the Johari Window, and it's really interesting. It sounds like a really cool title, but it was like two guys, one guy named Joe, another guy named Harry, and they created together the Johari Window. So it's not like some like interesting thing. It's really just Joe and Harry's window. But it is a way of really thinking about this concept of perspective. And then the other thing that's helpful when navigating the idea of unlearning is the concept of competing truths. That there are things that are true and simultaneously contradictory. So we're each unique and like no one else. We're like some people and unlike other people. We are each like all other people. Those things can be simultaneously true. And they're also contradictory with each other. So Western European art music is beautiful. It has also in America been a legacy of segregation and exclusion. It's simultaneously those things. And I think that as we start thinking about understanding this concept of the competing truths, it does open you up to being able to unlearn that those things are not in conflict with each other, right? They're just competing truths. They're simultaneously true. And I love it. I just had to find somewhere to put this quote by Ibram Kendi because I love it. Michael Bobbitt, who's the head of the Mass Cultural Council here in Massachusetts, he brought this to my attention at a class that I was co-teaching with my colleague, Nicole Dufashard, called Disrupting White Supremacy in Arts Organizations. And the comment is, the heartbeat of racism is denial. The heartbeat of anti-racism is confession, is admission, is acknowledgement, is the willingness to be vulnerable. Right? So the heartbeat of anti-racism, the heartbeat of this future is actually being able to acknowledge the competing truths, not denying some of the truths. It's giving yourself some time to exist inside them both. And then the last thing is that we have to have a growth mindset. There's been a lot of conversations about growth mindset, the Carol Dweck, just research around growth mindset. And as you're thinking about the concept, anyone who went to an art school, most of us, especially performing arts, depending on the type of performing arts you were in, we were probably taught more to have a fixed mindset. It's inside the training. You go through book 1, you go through book 2, you go through book 3, right? Like that is a very fixed way. You start with this etude book, you go to this etude book, you play these 5 pieces. And that's very much a fixed mindset way of navigating an artistic endeavor. And so we were then trained to shy away from things we don't know, right? We go to our teacher says, oh, well, I don't know that book, so you can't play it. I never heard of that one, so you can't do it, right? And so we then get trained inside the system that kind of forces us to develop a fixed mindset. And then on the other side, there's this concept of the growth mindset, where you start to view challenges as opportunities. It's like, I want to, oh, wow, I don't know how to do that. I want to learn to do that. Acknowledge and embrace your weaknesses. You have this humility that allows you to be able to say, that's an area that I can grow, right? On these bottom two here, understanding that failure is an opportunity to grow, persisting in the face of face of setback, excuse me. Persisting in the face of setbacks, like really being able to do that. Okay, so now we're going to open to our first little bit of just conversation. Please feel free to be on screen. I like to see faces, but it's not a requirement. Just with some guidelines. I have one of my colleagues who hates that I have guidelines, but I got to put them up there anyway. Accept each speaker's viewpoint is true for them. No assumptions except good intentions, unless someone is assuming so someone actually has bad intentions, but I don't think so. Don't blame or assume blame. Focus on your own learning. That's what I'm going to be doing today for sure. Embrace the likelihood of lack of closure. One microphone, one voice, and don't yuck my yum. If someone says yum to something, we're not going to yuck that. So I'm going to stop my share after I give us a guiding question. My guiding question is, what are some barriers, challenges, and/or fears related to the concept of unlearning, confronting our blind spots, accepting competing truths, maintaining a growth mindset? And I'm going to copy these and put them in the chat as well. Feel free to raise your hand. For those of you, I'm going to stop my share before I make this comment. So does anyone have any questions there? Jazz, I think I saw your hand go up. Jasmine, sorry, I think I saw your hand go up.
Oh, good evening, everyone. Jasmine Bonner, she, her, hers. Maybe just thinking about, as we think about unlearning, one of the things that I'm sort of having trouble with is finding if I'm unlearning a model, what is the new model that I'm learning? And how sometimes, and how, in this moment while we're embarking on a lot of this work is so new. So there's not always a book that I could turn to. There's lots of different articles, lots of different theories about approaching this stuff. And so, but nothing like that is like, this is the new model, this is the new way of doing it. And sometimes it feels sort of scary to deviate from what we know, right? Even as I think about like, what does it look to fundraise, and trying to think about what our relationship is to money and the people that we are partnering with, right? I have trouble figuring out, okay, well, I want to, move away from something that feels like super transactional, but I don't know what those other models are, and I don't know how to keep them like financially viable for the organization that I'm trying to support. And so those are some of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of unlearning processes.
No, thank you. That's a really good question. I will offer up a suggestion and also open it to others as well if they have a suggestion as to what are you learning, what are you unlearning, to what end. One of the books that I've read many years ago and read again recently was Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And that was a really helpful book to give me just kind of a line of sight into what the end goal is. And the end goal is liberation. And so when I'm thinking about what am I unlearning, what towards what, unlearning an oppression-based mindset so that I can then learn toward a liberation-based mindset. And as you're learning new parts of the unlearning, you're going through the unlearning process, it's like, I understand what I'm trying to unlearn. I'm trying to unlearn this kind of oppressive, pick yourself up from the bootstraps mindset towards a liberation mindset that amplifies the voices of all of those, particularly those whose voices have been silenced or marginalized. And whatever that looks like for an individual. Right, that would be an idea of a thing to that. And I'm gonna, before I call on Mariana. Hi, Mariana, nice to see you. I'll take one from the chat here. Fear is born of the thread when pulled. When will it stop? Are all my truths headed to the waste bin? I think that's an interesting question, and I would. I would say it just depends. I would say that a hope might be that maybe some of if the truth might have been based on the kind of subjugation of a group or two, then maybe all the components of that truth might, from a liberation perspective, might go into the waste bin, especially as it relates to its relationship to those individuals. Right? Because those individuals should be able to exist in a space of liberation for themselves. And so it's not so much individual truths, it's really thinking about it from the perspective of a collective truth. Do I want to have a truth that oppresses another group or another individual? Do I want that to be my truth? I don't think so, but I think that would be an additional question to ask alongside that. And again, and please, anyone else, as you are comfortable, please feel free to make a comment or share in the chat as well. Mariana?
It's nice to see you. Hi.
Hey.
Everyone. So sorry, I'm still in the classroom. Yay. Okay. Okay. So I guess I'll start with one of the biggest unlearning moments that I had that I felt really embarrassed by, I guess, which was the fact that in my books growing up, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star says very clearly that it was written by Ciccone Suzuki. And I was like, okay, so it was written by Suzuki, so that's what it was, and that was fine. And then it blew my mind later. I'm not going to say exactly how old I was later, but it blew my mind that it wasn't written by Suzuki. Like, I thought that it was, and it was an untruth. And I unlearned it very quickly. And then I went toward the other side. So it's just as an example. Like, I went toward the other side to say, like, why would someone take credit for something that they didn't actually write? Okay. So I think as a teacher and as a mother, I'm always constantly learning. I'm always unlearning things that I thought that I knew. And children are really good at teaching you that. I think they're really good at teaching you what you didn't know. And what you thought you knew, you actually don't know. And those old sayings of, like, you know, the more you know, the more you don't know, like the more you understand that you really don't know. Those, like, all the quote unquote old sayings or the things that I grew up hearing are becoming more true as I grow older, because I understand how much I actually don't know. But I think that it's so important to teach children through our own faults and teach using our examples, like I just did, to say, like, it's okay for you not to know everything. The thing that is scary is to Miss Jasmine, I believe that's her name. I'm sorry if I got it wrong. Point is, like, trying to build the plane while flying it, which I think we've kind of felt most of COVID, or at least, I don't know, I felt like that for most of my teaching during this period. And that is the scary part, the unlearning, the learning, the how do I bridge the two? How do I marry the two? So I guess my question, or my overall arching question is, how do you maintain a growth mindset with all of the encompassed, you know, like, flying and not flying, like trying to tell somebody, yes, this is the way, but yet you don't know the way yourself. So let's put it that way.
That is the first off, there was a lot of solidarity when you made your comment about being a parent and how you learn a lot. I saw Mr. Eggersheim kind of give you some silent support there. It was like, yes, we definitely hear that, and I felt the same. Speaking as a parent of now almost 2 teenagers, I definitely feel that. But I think that when you're to your comment about having a growth mindset, how do you maintain a growth mindset? And I think that this was actually a difficult time because many people were isolated, right? And so when you're just around the same people who are having the same experience a lot, that's a muscle that can atrophy. right? The idea of having a growth mindset and trying to grow. It's like, well, I haven't had to grow in a year, really. I mean, I've had to grow as far as technology and some other spaces, but maybe not in the same way socially, right? Like, we haven't had to grow in that way. And so I think that that's a really good question. But as you're thinking about how to navigate building the plane while you're flying it, I think that, and this is something that's maybe just my own frame, is thinking really intently about where you're going. That's why when CMCB shares that vision, that's why vision is so important, because vision always provides a sense of a North Star, right? So what's the point of building a plane if I don't know where it's going, right? Like, to what end? I don't even know what type of plane to build. Right? And so having that idea and the concept of really having a North Star that you're moving toward can be really helpful as you're thinking about having a growth mindset. Now I'm going to go on to thank you for, this is a great conversation. I'm going to go on to the next part where we're codifying some terms. So I'm going to reshare my screen with all of you. Thank you all for your comments. If I missed anything from the chat, would Sarah or Kenneth, would you let me know if I missed anything from the chat? But I'm going to share my screen now. And now we're going to talk about codifying some terms. And why do we need to codify some terms? Because we all have different experiences. We have different lived experiences, right? And so because of that, codifying terms becomes a really important practice. And it's an important practice for individuals, ensembles, and institutions to do with themselves. It's making sure that when you say a word like cultural inclusion, or when you say a word like diversity, do we even mean the same thing? So when we have this goal of being more diverse, do we even mean the same thing when we are using that term? Because to some people, being diverse means having a bunch of white people and then one of each, right? And they're like, we're diverse. See, we've got the Latin guy, we've got the indigenous person, we got the Black guy, we got the Asian guy, and 297 white people, right? But we're a super diverse group because we got one of each, right? There are some people who they view it from that perspective. We have a super diverse programming. We got to do a Black History Month, we do a Latin Heritage Month, we do an Asian, right? Like, and so again, so when you're codifying terms, you're doing it to make sure you're all on the same page when you use the term. Actually remove some of the conflict. So we all have different lived experiences, and our lived experiences shape our understanding of language. Terms to define, what I'm going to share with you today are tokenism, culture, cultural inclusion, and cultural colonization. And we're going to have some shared definitions for those terms. I put a link here for a really nice glossary of terms. I would recommend giving it a look. There are a lot of terms there that people may not fully understand, but this is a great kind of entry-level way to begin some thinking about some of these terms. So the first term that we're going to discuss, or I'm going to share with you, is tokenism. See, to that thing, look, we're diverse. We've got Tyrone here, right? We're a diverse group. Tokenism is the practice of making only a perfunctory or symbolic effort to do a particular thing. And then this second sentence is the key. Tokenism is a byproduct of trying to identify the minimum standard rather than actually trying to attain moral enlightenment. Organizations, institutions, ensembles, and programs, they engage in tokenism when they're trying to understand for themselves what's the minimum standard that we have to meet in order for us to be okay. They're not actually seeking liberation or moral enlightenment. Just, I want to have a sense of what the minimum standard is. And it can manifest itself with individuals, the programs, and throughout institutions. So you see, you look here on the left, you've got, there's one. And so that's a start. So let's see if we can get another one maybe. Right, and so this idea of tokenism is that trying to make an effort that shows that I'm maybe kind of trying, even if I'm failing. It also has this byproduct of doing what they call othering. So the individual constantly feels like the other. Everyone is one thing, I'm the other thing. And the next definition is the idea of culture. Culture pertains to the customs, art, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other group. This next sentence is important. A social system of meaning and custom that is developed by a group of people to assure its adaptation and survival. When we start talking about culturally specific places, this will make more sense. These groups are distinguished by a set of unspoken rules that shape values, beliefs, habits, patterns of thinking, behaviors, styles of communication. Now, people tend to mistake culture as race, right? It is, it can be, but it's a bunch of other things too. I'm not familiar with the hip hop race, but I'm very familiar with hip hop culture. Well, not very familiar, but sort of familiar with hip hop culture. Now, one of the challenges I had, I remember moving to New England from Memphis, Tennessee. I've been there for 13 years, grew up in Texas. Then I was in Memphis in the Deep South. And when I moved to New England, it was a very different culture. The first thing I did, I'm the new executive director of this school. Saturday is our biggest day. People are all over the place. I go down the hall and I talked to one of the parents who didn't know who I was. And I was like, "Hi, nice to meet you." And she was just like, "Hi." I was like, "Hi, I'm the new executive director here. I'm Lecolion." And she was like, "Oh, I assume you're not from New England." And I was like, "No, I'm not." She's like, yeah, we don't do that." She said, "Yeah, we don't really do that." So it seems like it's a place that maybe you don't talk to strangers. In the Deep South, you do it all the time. Well, it's like not even a thing to talk to a stranger. Everybody's your cousin at least, right? But up here, she was like, "Oh, yeah, we don't do that." I see some, or maybe she just didn't like me. I don't know. It could be that. But there were definitely some just cultural differences for me moving here. And it was a thing I had to get used to. I had to actually get used to a place that was, in many ways, quite liberal and yet not so. It was much easier in the Deep South. It was relatively conservative. You kind of knew what you were going to bump into. In many of the places I was in, not every place, but in some places, it was really, really simple. It's like, we don't like any of those. We don't like gay people. We're not about Black people, immigrants. Like, those are things that we're just not about that, right? And then to move to New England, where there's so many things that are clearly normalized, and yet for it to be a place that is completely dumbfounded by race, that was really difficult for me culturally to understand that. Until I recognized that particularly Boston was a place that it was really good at understanding marginalizations that it could frame in whiteness. And so, like, once I understood that concept, that made it all make sense to me. It all made a whole lot more sense to me, because then you think about gender, religion, sexual orientation, like those are things that can be age, those are things, ability, those things can be framed in whiteness. And the one thing that can't is race. And so it's got the cities kind of like, I don't know how to do that, right? And so, but again, there was a cultural shift because I came from a city that was 60% Black. And so again, it was just a cultural thing that was a challenge for me to get through. But again, culture is more than just race. It is musical genre. If you go to a classical music concert and then go to a Beyonce concert, the culture in those places is going to be very different. There's a culture around. And then cultural inclusion is the practice of authentically bringing traditionally excluded individuals and or groups into processes, activities, and decision-making decision/policymaking in a way that shares power, creating and expanding spaces so that they equitably recognize the customs, art, social institutions, and achievements of various nations, people, and other social groups. And this last sentence here is the key to that. Rather than asking who is being included, culturally inclusive practices ask who is being marginalized or excluded. So it's not a concept of patting yourself on the back when you got one. It's actually being really honest with yourself and say, who's being left out? Who's not being included or marginalized? And then equity is the armor against tokenism as it relates to cultural inclusion, right? Because if you're thinking about it from an equity perspective, then you recognize when there's just kind of too much of one culture that's being amplified. Because the truth is, if there is too much of one culture being amplified, the other cultures in place recognize that. They can see it really clearly. And then this last term here, or last term is cultural colonization. This is a big one because this is in many ways the root of tokenism. Cultural colonization can be defined as some form of invasion, dispossession, and subjugation of the culture of a people. Many organizations have community engagement programs. Their community engagement programs tend to engage in cultural colonization. Because the goal is to invade a space with a new culture that is not rooted in the space. That is a colonial, it's a colonizing mindset. The invasion can begin as geographical intrusion, leading to marginalizing or discrediting the artistic creations from the original inhabitants. What we're bringing is better than what was already here. The colonizer-colonized relationship benefits the colonizer at the expense of the colonized. So it's a replacing of a culture with another one. And then being mindful that tokenism, in my opinion, is used to mask the goal of cultural colonization. So we're really trying to take over the whole thing, but we got to have a few here to kind of mask that. And so we're thinking about it from a perspective of tokenism and how it can sometimes manifest itself. Now I will speak very humbly and candidly. I've done it. I personally have been a cultural colonizer. I've done it many times, actually. I didn't recognize it at the time. But again, as we move to these conversations about no blame, shame, or guilt, I've had to learn that too, about my own self and giving myself a little bit of grace that as I learn, I can change. But I can honestly say very humbly that I have done every one of these things. Especially when we get to some of the pitfalls. I'll be just basically telling you my life story. So now we're going to open up to questions again. Just a reminder of the guidelines. And here is our guiding question for now. Which of these terms is the most meaningful to you and why? Tokenism, cultural inclusion, cultural inclusion, or cultural colonization? I'm going to stop my share so I can see all of your faces. Which one of those terms was the most meaningful to you and why? Garrett?
Yes, thank you. The word I'll use is triggering. The term that's always the most triggering for me is tokenism. I feel like we talk a lot about what tokenization is. I think we still need to develop the conversation of what it means to be tokenized. What price are we paying? Do we even realize our tokenization? To sort of apply that word to this presentation. You know, like you, I start most of my presentations with land acknowledgements, and I've really had to sit with myself. Well, I had to sit with myself and think about: am I tokenizing a practice? Am I just performing, or do I mean it? You know, what does it mean to really, like, I'm calling today from the land of the Wapakudi Sioux. So when I acknowledge this as their land, what are my expectations for that when it comes to homeowners? What is my expectation when it comes to our opinions about what's going on in Palestine, for example? I think when we talk about cultural colonization and specifically tokenism, there's always room for growth, and there's always room to make sure that, you know, we aren't perpetuating some sort of tokenization.
No, I think that you are, you know, it's interesting. And I thank you for that, Garrett. That was very well stated. I think about that a lot as a leader who is now working with a lot of individuals now inside our institution who are of various cultures. And I sometimes ask myself, are there these moments inside our institution in which I am tokenizing another group? You know, like when are the moments in which I'm doing that as a Black man? I would say that do I recognize it? Because again, and from my position, maybe I don't. But I think that, to your point, Garrett, I think that where the conversation that we're having is maybe a little bit different is maybe some people don't even ask these questions. Maybe there are some places who are not thinking about what does it mean to be a homeowner on lands that were stolen. Like, they don't even grapple with the significance of that. And so as we're thinking about seeking moral enlightenment, right? Grappling with that is a part of the pathway, right? It's a step. And not grappling with that is denial of that as a component. That was, thank you so much. I'll call on Akila and then Mariana.
It's Akela, but thank you.
Akila, thank you. Sorry, my apologies.
No worries. Most people get it wrong. On my first day of teaching anywhere, I have to write it phonetically in my name, my Zoom name, just so the kids get it right. I also agree. Tokenism, I mean, all of these terms really have an effect on me, but I think tokenism is the one that definitely pops out. And I think also, as a white person, as a white educator who is, working towards these goals of being culturally inclusive and diverse and intersectional and all the things that, we, as at least at CMCB, we're all about social and emotional and culturally conscious education. And those are the things that I want for myself as a teacher and as a human being. But at the same time, I have this lived experience of being a white woman who's raised middle class and frankly had a lot of opportunities growing up that put me in a good spot to do what I do today. And I think tokenism is a hard word for some white people who consider themselves woke and progressive to hear. Same way that when white people are told that they're something that they say is racist, or, and I'm not saying all white people, of course, I'm saying this is a general pattern that we're starting to see and acknowledge, is there's a tendency to get defensive and be like, oh, well, I would never tokenize someone. I'm never going to be like, oh, look at how diverse our staff is. We have, one person that is bilingual or something like that. And, there's always been, I'm definitely as progressive as I try to be and want to be, I'm always going to have pitfalls. And I think that's the number one thing when we hear words like tokenism. And, you kind of just have to realize that this is a process and that everyone is learning. But for me as a white person, it's so important to do that learning and not like necessarily rely on oppressed individuals to help me learn that. Like we can Google it, you guys. Like most of the time you can Google it. And I think, I guess just like breaking down that immediate reaction of being like, I would never do that. I'm not racist. I don't tokenize people. I like all of the things that well up, all this like white guilt that wells up in us white folks who are well-meaning. I think it's really important just to acknowledge that and how that plays a role in our lives and what we do. And that looks different for everyone. Sometimes for me, that means when my grandma is talking to me about her life and she's like, oh, well, I met this very nice young man he was a nice African-American young man. She always loves to say, whenever the person isn't white, she'll specify their race. And now we've had to, even though she's, 82 years old, we've had to be like, hey, so if you're talking about meeting a white person and you don't specify that person's race, like, why are you specifying the race of other people that you're meeting? So that's part of just like my day-to-day like family life, is just being like, okay, grandma, but like, why'd you say that?
Right.
Because she wants to learn. Right. Sorry, I'm talking too long.
No, it's okay. That's okay. That's okay. I think that, there were several things in there. I think they're important, and you're going, chapter and verse through the Robert DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, right? Like white normalizing. There's so many things in there that I think that you're going, you go right through it. And it's one that I recommend people reading for themselves, especially if you're trying to understand the social construct of whiteness and the way it manifests itself in America. And it was Dave Chappelle. He said this once. I saw him getting an award at Harvard a couple of years ago. And he said this one thing. He talked about himself. It was like, being as a Black man, he said that y'all just don't know how difficult it is to be around y'all all the time. And that was his way of like having this conversation about this book. He was getting a W.B. Du Bois Award. That was kind of the thing that he shared there. And that's, again, because the things that's a blind spot, right? So inside that book, there are these things that's a blind spot. So if you read that book and if you read that book probably as a white person, if there's a high probability that some blind spots will be illuminated, some things that other people see that maybe the group doesn't see about itself. Mariana, and then Kathleen, and then we'll have to move.
I'll try to go as fast as I can, I guess. I guess the thing that resonates with me the most is the music culturalization or cultural colonization aspect. As a classically trained musician, it's incredibly difficult because of all the music that I was taught versus what I know is also currently out there and what I was not taught. So there's like a lot of the miseducation of not just Lauryn Hill, but like all of just myself. And so it becomes really difficult in terms of what to teach my students, because now it's a question of like how to culturally how to teach pedagogy with a cultural lens that is inclusive, like 100% inclusive. I guess maybe that's my statement. So that's the cultural colonization question of like that all these things are still good. Like classical dance is great. All these techniques are great. But how do I get to teach it in a cultural lens where they don't feel Yeah, sorry.
No, I think you're saying, I think that the fact that you're asking that question means you're going to get there much sooner than most. Because you're authentically asking that particular question. Again, I think that being really thoughtful about that, I think, about how you're asking, engaging in that dialogue and trying new and different and unique ways to do that. That's kind of what we're talking about here at CMCB even, is how do we do that? How do we become more culturally inclusive? It says it in the vision, but how do you operationalize that, right? Like that's the part that people are still trying to figure out. But I think one thing, Mariana, is think about who are the people that you can commune with who are on the same journey, right? And because I don't think it's going to be done by one, it's going to be done by many, and the many need to find each other. And typically in institutions, it's one inside an institution, but those ones inside the institution need to find each other and really do and be about that work. Kathleen?
Just real quick, colonization in terms of the neurodiverse community is such a big issue. Like for example, eye contact with autistics. My daughter's autistic. And a lot of autistics have a hard time with that, right? And as neurodiverse, as non-neurodiverse people, a lot of times we demand eye contact to feel like we're being paid attention to, and it's about us being felt like we're being attended to. And for them, a lot of times they either hear or they see, they can't do both. It's too much, right? And so I feel like there's a lot of colonization, a lot of this when it comes to people that think differently or have different needs. And it's something that I see all the time. And these poor kids have to mask and they have to pretend that they're one of us all the time just to feel included or right.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
That's it.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Thank you all. This has been a great conversation. Thank you. So now, important questions to ask with no blame, no shame, and no guilt. And the way that we'll engage in this conversation about the questions to ask is you start with your organization. What's the organization that you're in? And then you go to your program, right? You go to what program do we want to create inside this institution? So the first question you should ask and be really honest with yourself, what does your organization actually do? This is one that I think CMCB, we still have a lot of conversations about. What does your organization actually do? Does your organization position itself as a partner or as a savior? And does your organization understand the difference between the two? Right? Does your organization say things like, well, they had nothing, now they got something, our work is done? And that's your standard of success? And also, does your organization promote an art form? Or does it promote a subset of an art form from a particular perspective? I think that's an important thing to grapple with, because it could be that what you believe your organization does isn't what it actually does. You might think it's a music organization, but it really is one type of music from one type of period, from one type of, from one area of the world. And recognizing there's music from everywhere. I think about this all the time. And there's this music that's called world music. That always trips me out because I'm like, what world is the other music from? Right? Like, how is world music even a thing? Right? Unless, of course, we've normalized one thing and just call it music. And then everything that's not that, we've othered and say it's world music. Right? Because that's a term that makes no sense. Next question to ask yourself inside your organization, when you're having these dialogues internally, who makes decisions in your organization? Do those who make decisions have enough agency around multiple cultures to recognize tokenism when it's happening? Would anyone in decision-making power even see it? And if not, is there someone or group of people that the organization, that the power brokers trust? And do those in power trust that individual enough to cede power to them, giving them total veto power over the product, over what becomes of the thing? I tell this story here. When I interviewed for the job here at CMCB, I was very candid in my interview. Like, probably more candid than someone should be when they actually want a job, right? But I was like very candid in my interview. And what I shared with the board was, I'm not a person who can be tokenized. I reject that as just as a person, because I was in academia for a long time. I had been in, kind of Western European art music for a long time. And I was like, you know what? I don't want to be tokenized anymore. My wife and I used to talk about, people wouldn't call me, but in February, my schedule was always packed with concerts. People always invite the Black bassoonists for Black History Month. And then maybe they don't invite them any other time. But when I was interviewing here, I said that to the board, and I was like, if you just want to hire a Black executive director, I'm not your guy. I'm not the one you should hire. You'll be unhappy with me, and I'll be unhappy with you. And it'll be a waste of time, a waste of both of our time. But if you about this life, I might be your guy. But that's a decision for you as a board to make. And not only did the board hire me, but in many ways they did cede some authority to me. And they gave me some room to make decisions that they didn't understand as a board, but they were not barriers to those decisions. And so when you think about who makes decisions in your organization, do you have a structure that's like that? Because I've now existed in it, I see it works for me anyway. And what's your organization's culture? I love this iceberg, the iceberg of organizational culture. It's a great image because it talks about the things on the top, vision, strategy, goals. That's the way we say we get things done. And then underneath that, our beliefs, these unwritten rules, people's feelings, the traditions. That's the way we really get things done. Right? That's the real truth of how things are done in an institution. And so when you think about both components of this iceberg, inside your institution, who were those who were not included when we built our beliefs, our traditions, our norms, and our values? Who was not included in that? Because they still aren't. If they weren't included in the creation, they're not included today until something new comes along and they're being included. The same thing with the policies, procedures, and vision. Who were those who were not included when we built our vision, our strategies, and our policies? Because those are the groups that are still marginalized by them. Because they weren't built with them in mind. And so being really thoughtful about that and asking yourself that inside your organization. And then the last thing is, who is your primary audience? And it's not necessarily just people who go to the concerts or who exist in your programs either. Those aren't always, not always your primary audience. The question is, who do we think about the most when we're making decisions? Do we think about the participants or subscribers, like the current ones? Do we think about new ones that we would like to have most of all? We think about just donors, our artists or our teaching artists, artistic staff, administrative staff, whatever. But who's your primary audience? Because that's who you're going to build the programs around. And then that last one here, what are the ways in which the members of the primary audience are all the same? Who's our primary audience and how are they all exactly the same? Because there is some way in which they're the same. It's either by race, socioeconomic status, or something like that. There is some way in which they're all basically the same. And if you start talking about individuals, well, we got Johnny, we got April, we got Susan, they're not like everybody else. And basically what you're saying, everybody else is something, that's your primary audience. And just being really mindful of it. I'm going to skip a section of conversation here. My apologies. I do want to respond to some that were in the chat, but I want to be respectful of your time. We're going to go to the next section here. Forgive me. We had great conversation earlier. Now, once you've done the interrogation of your organization, then you can start having conversations about a program itself. So for example, there's an organization before I go to the next slide, there's an organization in Boston called Castle of Our Skins. They do they are focused on Black artistry, not just Black music. If you ask Ash Gordon, who was head of that, she talks about Black artistry and Black entrepreneurship. That's her bag. If Ash does a concert of music by Black women composers, it's one thing. If an all-white string quartet does that once a year, it's something else. So who the institution is and what it does matters, right? As it relates to navigating the idea of tokenism. Like, that matters. And so that's why we start with, what's your institution, who is it, and what does it do? Because it does matter. It's going to impact whether or not the program you're creating is a tokenized program. Okay, the first thing to ask yourself when creating a program is, who is centered? You can always count on me to try to throw in a Boondocks cartoon in the middle of it. This is a great one. This is Jasmine and Huey. Huey is like this kind of leftist, militant Black little kid. He's maybe like 10 or 12 years old. But he's got this girl, Jasmine, who's got a super like hard crush on him. And so in this comic, they're talking and she says, "Hey, Huey, what does Euro, whatever you said, mean?" And Huey says, "Eurocentrism." And he says, "Well, it's when you eliminate the African perspective and marginalize or omit people of color, their contributions, their experiences, etc. Understand?" And she's like, "Not really." They're like, "Well, do you ever watch Friends?" She says, "Yeah." It's like, "Well, then you understand. Because I don't know how you can live in the middle of New York City and not see any brown people." That seems like it shouldn't be possible, but they were able to do it on Friends. But anyway, here is, are we focusing, when you're creating your program, are you focusing your attention on your partners or some marginalized group's experience? Are you ensuring that the partner is empowered to drive the key aspects of the partnership? Or are we functioning like colonizers? We're really centering ourselves and our organizations and their experiences. We're centering our primary audience. We're like, I don't know if my audience is gonna like that, so we won't do it. We will ignore everyone else. Because you are probably going to land, if that is where you go in that thinking, you're going to land in a tokenizing program. At that moment, when it's like, I don't think our donors are gonna like it, then let's not do it. Let's do this instead. I don't think our audience can like it, so let's do this instead. That replacement will be a tokenized program. Are we trying to get a particular group of people to become more involved with us? So you're centering someone else's experience, not the culture that you were trying to uplift, not that experience. Typically, it will land in a tokenized program. Who has the power to drive the direction? Now, I personally am King T'Challa. I know some people are Killmonger, but I'm pro T'Challa. That's just me, maybe. But power is the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. So who has power in this program? CMCB, we're talking about having learner-centered programs. That's because we're trying to navigate this concept, the concept of power. Who has the power? So when we think about the conservatory model, those of you who went to music school or went to theater school, there was this master teacher. Well, you as a student were an empty vessel and you had nothing to offer, but you had this master teacher who was going to pour their brilliance into you as an empty vessel. And if you got enough of it on you, maybe you could then become a master teacher as well. But you had no power in that. What would it look like if your teacher said, what are the things you like to learn? And let's see if we can use what you like to learn to develop your skill set. What would it look like if we looked at these individuals that we worked with, and looked at our communities and said, what do our communities want? It's a completely different process. than saying, this is what I want to give a community. Because again, that's a power shift. So who has the power? And then how are we being held accountable? Are we holding ourselves accountable, or are we creating ways for somebody else to hold us accountable? And this next one, should we have a metric of success? I've had a conversation recently about this, and it was an interesting one. But the word accountability has the words "a" and "count" in it. So I think it's a good idea to take account, but you may not need certain types of metrics if you have lived values that are centered around equitable inclusion. If you're not just your stated values, but your lived values are centered around that, you may not need the same types of metrics. But if you're trying to find the minimum standard, get yourself a metric. If your end goal is to find, it's like, we want to have 25% of our pieces by women. If that's what you're going for, get yourself a metric. But if you're trying to equitably include the voices of women composers and women musicians, you won't need it. Because you'll see them everywhere. Your metric will be just to prove what you're already doing and what you already believe and what you already value. But if you don't, get yourself a metric, say 25%, right? Get yourself a metric. Because again, and that's tokenism, because definition of tokenism is identifying what's the minimum standard. And so a metric can be helpful. And then the final thing is who benefits from this program, which individuals, institutions, and communities. This has something to do with not only the program itself, but the money. Did you get $500,000 to invest $50,000 in a community? Because who really benefited from that? Did you get $500,000 to hire contractors and artists and musicians and people who have no relationship to that community? That's a colonial mindset, right? So again, who's receiving the funding and how are they reinvesting that funding in an inclusive way? And I've got one last little, I'm gonna skip this conversation. Oh, cultural appreciation. Cultural appreciation is when someone seeks to understand and learn about another culture in an effort, and this is to the question that was in the chat previously about how do you do this? This is when you're seeking to understand and learn about another culture in an effort to broaden your own perspective and connect with others cross-culturally. And so if you're trying to learn about another culture, how do you do this? You try to bring in individuals who are from that culture and give them the opportunity to tell people about it. That's how you would do that authentically. I want my students to know more about Juneteenth. So I'm going to bring in someone who knows about Juneteenth to do that. And I'm going to learn from them. But I won't just do it on my own. Because remember, people tend to know how to celebrate their own culture, right? So they won't have to take a class on how to celebrate their own culture. Rather than clumsily creating your own events and celebrations, connect with people from other cultures by attending and supporting the events of the cultures that you'd like to learn more about. So if you want to know, go places where people are celebrating a culture and be there. Immerse yourself in the culture that you want to uplift. Don't just borrow from it. Because we're talking about inclusion means changing ourselves. It's liberating ourselves, not just the young students that we're working with. For those of you who are teachers, who, God bless you, for real. Especially now during COVID. But how am I being the person? Not how am I presenting this to my students, but how am I becoming morally enlightened in a really meaningful and authentic way? And forgive me, I'm going to go through this last. We'll go back. Please write down your questions. Was there a question from the chat? I can answer one. I got to go with one. I can't go through too many without asking. I got room for one question, if I can figure out how to go backwards. Which of these questions in both sections would you consider to be your organization's greatest blind spot, challenge, or a strength? You're like, my organization actually does that power question really well. Anyone have an example of something that your organization has a blind spot for? It's like, wow, we never talk about that. Or we talk about that, but we just don't kind of do it right. We're still challenged by it. Or it's like, we talk about that and I think we do it well. Anyone have any examples of that? It's hard out in them streets. Mariana.
Oh, sorry, I shouldn't be talking. There are a lot of other people who have their hands up.
Oh, no, actually, you know what? Let me go to Leah, because Leah had a question I wanted to refer to previously. If you don't mind, Mariana, we'll talk about it later. But Leah, please.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about that second question about who has the power to drive the direction. I work with an organization that it has a lot of artists from a lot of different genres and different cultural art forms that are represented. So in terms of the diversity of the artistic offerings and artists that we have in our organization, it's very diverse. But at the moment, our programming committee, the one that is responsible for looking for new artists to add to our organization, or new program and evaluating new programs to add to our organization, that is not a very diverse group of people in terms of age, in terms of socioeconomics, in terms of geographic location within the city, and also in terms of race. And so just thinking, I think as an organization, we're thinking about, we've been talking about and we've been thinking about trying to change that to make sure that as we continue to add new programs, evaluate new programs, that we are not doing it with a single lens, that we're doing it with a broad lens.
Thank you for that. That's an interesting comment. I have like three things I want to just go off very briefly. One is one of the things that I do with organizations. You can always see their org charts on their websites. And I oftentimes will go and look and see, I say all the times, like, where is the moment in an organization when non-white voices kind of stop mattering? And you can always see that there's some point in the org chart where it's like, oh, there it is. There's like always a point there. I'm not saying, again, no blame, shame, or guilt, but it is something that I tend to look for and look toward. I guess that in your case, if you do have these other individuals who are engaged in the institution, the question is, how much power do they have? And do those who are in power really listen to them and take their cues from them? Or are they barriers to the success? And, again, it does sometimes, depending on who's in leadership, it does require some really important conversations about that, about like who's in power, what perspectives are in power, and where are some moments in which those perspectives are not a value add, because there's times in which they just aren't, and having them have the humility to know when to step back. And the other thing I was thinking about as you were sharing was when places try to recruit people of color, I always push back on that. Because oftentimes what you'll do is you'll recruit someone into a place that's traumatizing for them. And so I tend to push back against these kind of recruitment processes. What I would tend to say is I would ask an organization, look at yourself and what are the things that you do that repel people who are not like you? How are you a repellent? Because no recruitment process is going to remove your repellent, right? So begin with the repellent before looking at your recruitment, or at least doing them simultaneously. Because again, it does center the people who aren't there as the problem to be solved for, and they're not the problem to be solved for, your institution is. And so that's just one small suggestion there, and actually having some conversations about it, again, from a space of humility. CMCB had to have those conversations many times. We still do. So I'm going to go on to our last few sets of slides here for the sake of time. Now, here are the common pitfalls. Let's say we think we've really got this program, and I don't think we're tokenizing anybody. I think we're good. Here's the common pitfall. The first one is it being anti-Black. And this is a quote, this is actually from a study, but it came from Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. Oftentimes programs can try to be more inclusive, but they end up trying to add representation from every group except for Black people. And they'll say, look, we're much more diverse. We don't have any Black people, but we have all these other folks. And it's kind of for this reason. There are also some anti-Black ways of thinking about programming. So these bullet points here, we only want to be around certain types of Black people. It's like an anti-Black narrative. Non-Black people who, so if I'm a non-Black person and I save Black people, that's a good thing. So that saviorist idea. Black people can save themselves, but they need us. They need me to save them. That's bullet point 2 there. But there's some deserving Black people. I don't want to be in a Black community. I don't want to go to any Black stuff. But there are some deserving Black folks who can come to my stuff. Right? It's the way that integration worked itself out in America. No one took their money out of white banks and put them into Black banks. Right? That's not what happened when integration happened. Right? Integration happened the reverse of that. No one was taking their school kids out of the white schools and putting them into Black schools when they were integrated. Right? And so many of these anti-Black things are byproducts of that thinking. So being mindful as you're creating your programming, trying to be more inclusive, that they don't then become anti-Black. The other thing is trying to be more inclusive and landing with cultural appropriation. The theft of cultural elements for one's own profit without understanding, acknowledging, or respect for its value in the original culture. And if this is a triggering image for anyone, my apologies. It's from the assumption that dominant culture can just take what it wants with no need to understand what it represents and what it means. That's a layer of thought that doesn't have to go into. Assimilation, everyone's aware of that. That's kind of a byproduct of colonization. Just some pitfalls to be mindful of. It's like, I'm gonna do this thing. And actually, there's some friends I have who are uncomfortable with even the idea of playing Black composers. I speak from a Black perspective because I'm a Black man. But some people are uncomfortable playing Black composers because you're playing Black composers who essentially have assimilated into this Western European art form. So it's not true to their own heritage. So it is a form of assimilation. So kind of just leaning into assimilation without actually thinking about the culture in and of itself. So I'm going to amplify the parts of you that are the most like me. So I'm still at the center. And then the last one is looking at your programs rather than looking at your whole system. So as I mentioned before, I would be busy all February. But I'm Black 12 months a year. I'm actually Black all year, not just in the month when some institutions decide they want to recognize my existence. And so I reject them. I will reject a Black History Month program in a second. I don't go to any of them. Unless, of course, I can see that my existence has been recognized throughout the year. That it's recognized that I'm Black 12 months. I don't become Black in February and then go back to be something else in March. Right? You know, it's like, I'm Black all year. So I look for places that are acknowledging my existence 12 months. Not in this performative way, when it benefits them. And so looking at the system, what does the system do overall? Not just what does this individual program do? So when you're putting together your program, put together your program and put into the broader context of your whole system. Because if it's tokenized inside your system, it's a tokenizing program. Latin people are Latin all year. Asians are Asians all year. Native Americans are Native American all year. Not just during these months. When you get to decide that, you know what, this would be a good time to acknowledge their existence so that they can give us money and come to our stuff. This would be a good time. All 12. So being really thoughtful about and recognizing that. So now I do want to open it up for questions, comments. We'll take another 5 or 6 minutes. I know we ran over just a smidge, but we started a smidge late, like 2 minutes. So I do want to give time for some of the questions. And Kenneth, is there anything from the chat that I should be aware of? I'm going to stop my share. And just know that we will, I think Sarah will send this slide deck.
There's nothing from the chat, really.
Okay, thank you. Sarah will send this slide deck, or someone from Sarah's team, who's our Chief Advancement Officer, someone will send you this slide deck so you will have it if you were taking notes. Know that you will also have the deck itself. I really want to make sure that people feel they have access to it. Any comments? Any of these questions that were, again, you think blind spots in your organization, challenges, strengths in your organization? Absolutely. To the question in the chat, can you share it with others? Absolutely. I had a private question here. What's the end game of that? And the end game of all of this work is, the beginning is the same, it's liberation. To me, if we keep our eyes towards how are we liberating ourselves alongside others. Ibram Kendi said this best too. He said it great. He said, racism is bad for white people too. And I thought that was such a great way of saying that, because it says that, he says that if you're existing in that system and allowing it to continue, it's impossible to be able to have any type of moral right, because there's a system around that you're allowing to exist. So fighting in it is liberating yourselves, not liberating another oppressed group. Because an oppressive system oppresses everyone, including the oppressor. Which I thought was a really nice way of framing that, that we all become free. And so thinking about it from a perspective of liberation, if I'm hearing someone saying that they're oppressed, I need to understand that. Because if they're oppressed, so am I. I'm trying to free myself. Right, and so I think that's a way of thinking about this concept. And so when you're thinking about tokenism in and of itself, it is an oppressor on the pathway to potentially being a liberator. And just being really mindful of that. Tony?
Yeah, just looking at the questions, I think one of the biggest barriers that we face right now is the vendors, right? Where we purchase our curriculum materials have not done this work. And like, so there's a few options, like we can curate our own stuff, or we can work with them. And like, sometimes we work with them and it's a waste of time because they don't make changes. They keep saying they will. And I think the biggest change we've made is just trying to bring in cultural bearers to do the professional development to help us curate our curriculum and bring them in. And that was something, like when I first came in, we brought in somebody to do PD on like taiko drumming and gamelan, and it was absolutely awful. And I thought it was great because the person's bio, he was an ethnomusicologist. He checked all these boxes, but like, that's when I learned like, oh, no, that was super duper wrong. For now on, like as just a precedent, whenever we're going to do anything cultural, we have to bring in cultural bearers with us and partner with them and compensate them. But it's super fun. I mean, in instrumental music alone, the tokenism that's occurring, right? Like Larry Clark, a composer that like students play from 4th grade on up, he had a pen name trying to be a Japanese female composer, right? And J.W. Pepper sold that music, and that music was on state lists. I mean, it's all a lie, and it's we have to like start from scratch.
Tony, would you mind sharing with people who you are?
Director for the arts for Boston Public Schools.
Go ahead, Tony. I'm sorry, I was being authentic. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Thank you, Tony. Yeah, I think that, again, this is one of those things where I think that what we're all saying, and we can all be in agreement on this, that it is not in the system yet. This is what happens. That's how grassroots movements start, right? Grassroots movements start because the system has failed a large group of people so much that they're like, okay, we're going to do something else. We're going to create a whole other system. That's what a grassroots movement is. And maybe we're at a moment in which we're seeking one. Because you're right, Tony, this is a conversation happening nationally. I'm on the board of the National Guild for Community Arts Education also. And it's the same thing that's happening nationally at every, community arts school in the country. It's like, how do we do this? It's clearly this is where the country is going. It's probably where it should have always been. And so, like, how do we do this? And so, to your point, the systems aren't going to create it. We're going to have to create it ourselves. That's why CMCB is doing the work it's doing. We're just like, listen, we're just gonna like invest and figure this out. And a funder said to me, he was like, listen, if you're thinking like an institutional funder, you figure the thing out and you give it away. That's what the Wallaces and the Mellons, those foundations do. They solve a huge problem and then they just give the data away. Here's how we did that, right? And so now it's time for maybe some of our institutions to essentially function the same way. Let's figure the thing out and then just give it away, right? Because we're not looking to make money off the thing. We're seeking systems change, right? And that means giving it away. And so I maybe some folks in this room will be the ones who do it. Well, again, thank you all. Thank you all so much for your great conversations, your great contributions to tonight. This was a really nice time. I'm glad we had a chance to have these conversations and, keep your eye on CMCB. We're going to be doing more of these. We're going to continue doing these conversations. As you saw, it's in our values now to have these conversations and for us to learn from you, which we really did learn. I'm looking forward to looking back at the video. But thank you all for your time. I'm going to go off screen, but to give everyone some comfort to leave. But I do want to say thank you all so much. I hope that you were able to connect with each other. Some of you, I saw some things happening in the chat. I hope you sent some direct messages and got some email addresses again, because we really want to be a connector as much as we can for all of you. So thank you all so much. Everyone have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.